Fulfilled all your thoughts about what Christians are like, just always on camp, talking about the Bible and hanging around campfires, and we really were doing all those things, acoustic guitars and the works. Anyway, it was a campsite that was a little bit out of Albany, and the mobile coverage wasn't that good, and so what would happen is people would go up to the top of this hill and send and receive their texts and emails and so on from their phones. The hill kind of became the technological equivalent of a smoking area at a modern airport, kind of a place where people congregated to talk and listen into each other's conversations. Anyway, I was there one night and I was sending texts or whatever. I wasn't involved in the conversation, but I couldn't help but eavesdrop as it was happening. Remember this Christian camp? And the conversation that I was listening in on turned to someone whose sister had lost her faith, having been raised in the Christian faith. She lost her faith at university, and it apparently came around on the theory of evolution. And these guys, all Christians, were discussing tactics to win her back to the fold. And one of the claims I overheard was this. They said, well, evolution is obviously wrong, because if we're all descended from monkeys, why are there still monkeys around? And everyone agreed it was a good argument, and they were going to try it out on this friend. And I sat there in silence, and I thought, man, if there was like an actual atheist here, the level of this conversation would be frankly embarrassing. As you know, as I hope you know, to say that evolution is disproved by the continued existence of monkeys is like saying that the origins of modern Australia and England are disproved by the continuing existence of England. It's just a really dumb argument, and I thought to myself, these Christians haven't taken the trouble to listen to the other side and understand the thing that they are opposing. And then within 2 weeks, I think about 2 weeks later, I was down at UWA and I saw some posters for the Atheist and Agnostic Society. We're having a lunchtime meeting, and I decided to go along. And I was slightly late to the meeting, so I didn't get my chance to explain that I was an irrational, God-loving imposter. And there I was sitting at the table, and the conversation was going, and I guess going as was the case on the hill in Albany, on the assumption that everyone shared the same points of view. And people came around to talking about the Christian faith, and one guy said, Christians believe that God put the fossil record in the ground to test people's faith. And again, I thought to myself, if they knew that an actual Christian was here, this conversation would be frankly embarrassing. And I went away thinking that I wish these guys had taken the trouble to hear the thing that they are opposing. Which is a long way of saying that this lecture is basically cheaper than therapy. The two incidents happened closely together, and they troubled me greatly on both sides of the equation. And it made me think, are we even listening to each other? If there's a group of people in Albany who are saying ridiculous things about evolution, and people in Perth saying ridiculous things about what Christians do or don't believe, I wonder whether I can make a humble contribution to the conversation by at least clearing the pathway and making sure we actually hear each other a bit better than we do. Now, I say that, and I don't want to be unclear or duplicitous about my purposes. I'm a Christian, and I don't want to pretend that there's this kind of third space, this secular space that you and I can both walk into, where it's all kind of daylight and love, and where we can agree with the same propositions and so on. I'm a Christian. I worship the God who's Father, Son and Spirit. I prayed to him this morning. I prayed for a parking spot and nailed it, actually. Got a really good one. And the ticket machine was broken. So there you go. Didn't even have to pay. Really love God, believe in God, would love to see more people come to know God in Christ. So I'm just putting that out there. I don't want to pretend I'm this kind of neutral third space guy. I'm not, but I do think that we can do better in our conversation and perhaps at least hear what each other say and clear some misunderstandings to open up the path to a better conversation. So here's what I propose to do, and you can follow along in your outline. What I propose to do is 4 things. I want to explain the title, why I'm still not an atheist. Secondly, I want to account for atheism, particularly the new atheism, as I've understood it. Thirdly, I want to respond to those challenges as best I can. And then finally, suggest a way forward that I think might be helpful. At least I have found it helpful. So firstly, let me explain the title. We've called the talk, Why I'm Still Not an Atheist. And the operative title, for me at least, the operative word is the word still. Because again, as a matter of truth in advertising, I was raised a Christian. That's my background, raised in a Christian family, and because that's my background, it's just not a very interesting talk to give a talk about why I'm a Christian, because the answer is pretty obvious. I was raised as a Christian. I realised that I could make that more interesting if I said that I used to be an atheistic drug-dealing pimp, and then suddenly I found out that God was true, and here I am. I guess that would be more interesting, but it just wouldn't be true, and the Bible says not to tell lies. So honestly, that's why I'm a Christian. But the truth is that people do make moves. I have remained in the faith in which I was raised, but not everyone does that. So people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, who have I got there? Leslie Stevens and Matthew Arnold. They're all examples of people who were raised Christian to a greater or lesser degree and found the Christian faith unsatisfying and the claims of Christianity untrue and have walked away. And I'd add to those photographs there several of my personal friends who have also walked away from the Christian faith. Of course, the traffic goes both ways. For every Matthew Arnold or Christopher Hitchens, there's a C.S. Lewis, there's an A.N. Wilson, there's a Francis Collins, there's a Peter Hitchens. And again, several of my personal friends who have been raised atheists or were atheists and have later found atheism to be unconvincing and turned to the Christian faith. I think in terms of the argument about which way does the smart traffic go, as far as I can see, it goes both ways. There are really smart people who reject Christianity in favour of atheism and really smart people who reject atheism in favour of Christianity. So I think we could at least call a truce on the basis of which way the smart traffic moves. But on top of that, in terms of the title, Why I'm Still an Atheist, I notice that the reasons people originally adopt the positions they adopt are often non-rational and intuitive. So, for example, the Australian author and Nobel laureate Patrick White was an atheist and came back to the Christian faith. And you ask, how did he do that? Well, the truth is that he was on his farm and he was carrying slops for the pigs and he tripped over in the rain and he fell down in the mud and he cursed God. And he said, in that moment, I realised the absurdity of my position and I decided to return to the Christian faith. Or Peter Hitchens, who returned back to Christianity after being an atheist through art and liturgy. Or Francis Collins, the head of the Genome Project, who turned from a childhood in atheism to Christianity, not through discovering, mapping the human genome, but through dealing with patients as a physician and noticing the way religious people die. Countless of thousands of other Christians have become Christians for perhaps unsexy reasons, I was raised one, or for seemingly personal and non-rational reasons, falling over in the mud or observing the death of religious people. That's true, but it's the same for many atheists. I did some research on why it is that atheists became atheists. How did they come to that point? And of course, you've seen photographs of people who have come to it in adulthood, but I'll give you some other examples. Ricky Gervais, the comedian, became an atheist at age 8. He was drawing a picture of God or something from the Bible, and his brother Bob walked into the room and he said, Ricky, what are you doing? He said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And Bob said to him, do you believe in God? And then his mum looked across the room and said, Bob! And Ricky said, at that point, I knew they were conning me. At that point, I knew there was some sort of cover-up and I instantly gave up my faith in God. Or Christopher Hitchens, who became an atheist in primary school when he had a slightly, perhaps, SRE teacher who told him that one of the evidences for the existence of God was the fact that most of the world was green, and that's good because humans like green, whereas purple is a much more ugly colour, and God exists therefore because he's made the world mainly green. I could add to that Philip Adams and many others who, at the point of conversion, if you ask why historically are you an atheist or why historically are you a Christian, the answer is actually shrouded in intuition and personal and sometimes mysterious reasons. So I think no matter how you came to your position, whether you're religious or atheist or agnostic, the better question to ask is not why are you that thing, but why are you still that thing? Because I don't think we're under any obligation to come to these things by some deductive, rational, logical move, but I think we are all obliged as rational beings to be able to account for why we're still that thing, having been presented with alternatives and having grown up. And so for what it's worth, not only am I a Christian, but I am still a Christian. I'm still a Christian, and I do not think, although it's easy to deceive yourself, I do not think I have just blind faith. I don't think I'm unaware of the alternatives, and indeed at different times I have been troubled by the challenges to Christian faith, troubled by some of the content of Christian faith itself. Sometimes I've found the Christian faith boring and frustrating and tedious, and aspects of it unbelievable. I have abandoned some of the things that I believed as a child and grown up with. My faith has been reshaped and rethought in the light of my understanding, greater understanding of theology and my greater understanding of a decent answer to the challenges. In my life, I've seriously considered conversion to Catholicism and in another guise to Islam, and have felt, I think, some of the weight of the objections and the alternatives to the Christian faith. And the most recent, challenge for me and cause for doubt and perplexity and being shaken has been the new atheism. In the last decade, a new atheism has emerged with a new energy and vitality, and a number of my friends have become ex-Christians as a result. Having observed this, I decided to take that seriously and read The Challenge, as many of you no doubt have done. The first book I read, which is the obvious place to start, I guess, is Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. And to be honest, when I started reading it, I was reading it to understand what my friends had done. But at the beginning of that book, you'll recall if you read it, Dawkins says this. He says, if you are a religious believer reading this book, it is my intention that by the time you've finished, you will have given up on that faith. You will have abandoned the faith that you had when you started reading it. And as it happens, I was in Quabba at the time on holidays in a tent, and it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, okay, he's thrown down the gauntlet. He intends for me to not be a believer by the end of this book. And I thought, in good faith, I owe it to Dawkins either to hear his reasons and to convert, or if I don't convert, to at least proffer a reason why it didn't work in my case, why I have remained in the thing that he would like me to move from. So anyway, that's the reason for the title. Secondly, let me give an account of the new atheism as I understand it. Of course, there are many rich varieties of atheism on the market today. There are people like Slavoj Žižek, who, while atheists, are deeply intrigued by and regularly publish on Christian doctrine and theology. Others, like Alain de Botton, who are unimpressed by Christian doctrine and Christian theology, but deeply attracted to Christian practice and ritual. But when I say the new atheism, I have in mind particularly the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're called: Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. That's what I mean when I'm talking about the new atheism. And as a movement, it came as a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. If, like me, you were reading cultural theory in the 1990s, you would never have predicted the arrival of the new atheism. The movement at the time in the universities and in the arts degree in which I was ensconced was all moving toward a postmodern form of relativism. Atheism was in sharp decline. Atheist institutions like the American Atheist Association were in disarray. There were books published with titles like The Twilight of Atheism. And thinkers like Derrida and Foucault and Rorty were far more interested in framing the debate not on the truth claims of religion, whether it was true or false, but on the discourse and the power play that religion offered and the narrative that it gave to the people who loved and lived it. But something changed with the new atheists, and I have three reasons, or at least three theories, for why the change. The first is that on September the 11th, 2001, something else came out like a bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. 3 planes were run into buildings, and the planes were run into the buildings by people who report to have been passionately committed to their belief in God and their understanding of their faith. And by religious fervour, they did something that is obviously terribly evil. And I think after that moment, after September 11, it became very hard to see religion as just an interesting discourse, as a narrative by which people understand their lives, because it showed itself in one particular manifestation to be capable of great evil. And explicitly, in the case of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, the event radicalised them. Their latent atheism, which had been with them for a long time, turned them to become new atheists who could no longer remain silent. Hitchens talks about having a new sense of purpose. He knew why he had to get out of bed in the morning. It was to oppose the tyranny of religion and the tyranny of God. September 11 made it impossible for many, including myself, to see religion as always and everywhere a benign and neutral force. Well, as well as September 11, I think the second big reason is the failure of secularization theory. Secularization theory said that with the coming of the great institutions of modernity, like the nation-state, representative democracy, free markets and so on, that movement to modernity would always necessarily include the decline of religion. That if democracy and free markets were to increase, religion would always decrease and move to a more secular running. But the theory ran aground by not happening, which ruins theories. Places like Malaysia and Indonesia surprised everyone by marrying development with and modernity with a rise in rather than a decline in religious belief, and orthodox religious belief. Where beliefs in Malaysia and in Indonesia are more likely to be conservative and traditional the younger you go. Places like Africa and Asia and Latin America are places that have seen Christianity thrive at the same time as development. Indeed, according to authors like Philip Jenkins and Rodney Stark, it has been Pentecostal Christianity and not Marxism or secularism that has been on a adherence scale the most successful ideological force of the late 20th and early 21st century. And then, of course, there is the stubborn case of the United States of America, where the world's most modern and progressive nation remains persistently, some would say stubbornly and annoyingly, religious. More people go to church or mosque or synagogue in America in a week than go to mosque in the theocratic Republic of Iran. And so, in short, what was offered, the secularization theory, as a predictive theory turned out to be merely a description of what happened in a small set of Western European nations. And I think the new atheism was energised by the thought that this thing, religion, wasn't dying of its own accord in the way we had hoped, and they seek to euthanize it, or maybe worse. Thirdly, I think new atheism has rejected and declared a failure postmodern epistemology. New atheism has returned with vigour to a much more logical positivist framework for its epistemological framework. For someone like me who's educated in the 1990s at uni, it's almost shocking for me, perhaps not for your generation, to hear Richard Dawkins ridiculing the traditional beliefs of Aboriginal Australians or American Indians and declaring them to be primitive and foolish and in some cases even evil. In my generation, that kind of conversation was reserved for the far right of politics. But the new atheists have made that kind of discussion possible and even mainstream, as they have rejected the relativism of postmodernism and have returned with vigour and hope to the scientific method as a way of acquiring truly warranted knowledge. What is new about the new atheism, which is what I'm trying to claim, is not its arguments. You'll find them in Hume and Voltaire, you'll find them in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's not its arguments that are new, but its tone. The new atheism is strident, it's evangelistic in its sense of urgency and purpose, and it's popular in the sense that it's not academics talking among themselves, but people talking to the populace and urging them to think again. You can see that flavour of the new atheism by comparing it with the Victorian loss of faith. In the Victorian era, in the 19th century in England, there was a great loss of faith, as there is now, but that Victorian loss of faith was characterised by a sense of sadness and mourning, a sense that something good was being lost and it was regrettable. You see that in the words of Matthew Arnold in his poem Dover Beach. He says, "The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." The Victorians often retained a great respect for Christianity, often regretted that they could not believe its doctrines, and often thought highly of Christ himself. But compared to that, the new atheism is much more celebratory, much more gleeful, much more despising of Christianity and of Jesus in particular. And that kind of crusading and popular tone means that some of the new atheists have lost some of their fellow contemporary philosophical atheists who have been disappointed with the popular level of the debate and look back with longing to the great atheists of the past, such as Voltaire and Hume, who on grounds of elegance and subtlety seem to be superior representatives of the atheistic cause. Anyway, that's my grasp of where things are. What's my response? Well, I want to kind of get a bit personal and tell you how I feel. And how I feel, to be honest, is a bit threatened. Sure, that the new atheists might not reach the heights of a Voltaire or a Hume in their argument, but they're not dumb people. And I'm not an especially smart person. And so to be confronted with arguments that I hadn't thought about or thought about deeply is to feel threatened. And on top of that, friends of mine have walked away from the Christian faith who themselves are not dumb but smart, sometimes smarter than me, and they have found the new atheist case compelling. But then on top of that, some of the language of the new atheism is enough, I think, to make any reasonable person feel a little bit threatened. So Sam Harris says this. He says, "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. This may seem an extraordinary claim, but it merely enunciates an ordinary fact about the world in which we live." Hitchens, Dawkins and Harris have all been explicitly pro the interventions of America and the Allies in Iraq and Afghanistan on explicitly religious grounds, seeing radical Islam as a great threat, and have favoured the use of violence to defeat it. That particular quote, to present it fairly, is directed against militant Islam. But I'll add to this Hitchens, who says this kind of language: Christianity proposes the hideous, the contemptible, the revolting, the dangerous, the suicidal idea which everyone in this room must teach themselves to repudiate, that we should love our enemies. You get a sense of the language and you can understand as why I might feel a little bit threatened. Well, I do feel threatened, but I should say I also feel thankful. As someone who was on campuses in the 1990s, it was just really hard to leverage a conversation about God because in the milieu of the time, he was kind of off the agenda. And I'm very thankful that a lecture like this can be heard and people attend it because God is back on the table for discussion. And thirdly, as well as feeling threatened and thankful, I must confess myself often to be in agreement with some of the claims of the new atheism. In particular, I'm very glad that the new atheism has challenged the idea that religion should get a free pass in public debate just because it's religion. With the new atheists, I agree that religion has been a source of great evil in our world. And I think it's vital that we name these things for the challenges that they are and call them the evil that they represent. The early Christians were called atheists for their refusal to worship the gods of Rome and the Caesar, and modern atheists similarly call us to not worship things that are not God, and I think that's a good thing not to do. Again, a bit personally, I've followed Christopher Hitchens' career for many years before he started publishing on atheism, and I can say he's by far my favourite journalist of the last 50 years. In the dinner party game, who would you have over for dinner if you could only have 3 people? Hitch has for many years been on my top 3. Just as I'm troubled by some of his things, his atheism obviously, but also his support for the intervention into Iraq and his wild optimism regarding Western military interventions, I'm also deeply impressed by his crusade against tyranny, by his political judgments and his literary judgments. In fact, sometimes when I read Hitch on the evils of religion, far from saying, don't say that, I want to say, you sound like Jesus, who, if you have read him, is constantly railing against religion and its evils. Well, to my point, the next point, why I'm still a Christian responding to the new atheism. So disappointingly, I guess, for many people, I'm still a Christian, and in honour of Richard Dawkins and many others, I want to give some reasons why I still am. The first reason I guess I'm still a Christian, or one of the reasons I'm still a Christian, is that I believe that God exists, and for all the power of the debate, I've yet to find a convincing argument to persuade me to abandon that belief. I've certainly read arguments and heard arguments that challenge that belief and point out weaknesses and deficiencies in that claim, but I'm yet to come across one that is more persuasive than the simple traditional Christian belief that God created all things. In the Christian tradition, I should explain, God is not a gap filler. He's not the thing that fits in the confusions in the fossil record or whatever. God is the source and ground of all being. He is the Christian answer to the reason that there is something rather than nothing. I believe in a creator God, and I've found the arguments against him, while sometimes impressive, ultimately unconvincing. For example, I find philosophical materialism, the idea that all there is space and time, deeply unsatisfying. It does not represent the majority of physicists who have long abandoned the idea that there's only space and time. I think they're up to 10 or 11 dimensions, which are considered real but are nowhere, like Hilbert space. Neither does materialism represent the majority of philosophers, who likewise are not philosophical materialists. I find the materialist case fails to account for at least our rationality. The idea that the mind is no more than the physical and chemical activities of the brain seems to me to leave you with the idea that our thoughts have only causal relations. That our thoughts are entirely causal, created by chemical and other processes. But it seems to me that if our thoughts are only causal relations, then they're not rational relations. Whereas reason and logic relies on our thoughts having rational relationships to each other. So if someone says to you, I do not like black people, and you say, why? And you say, because a black person once hurt me, then we immediately reject that as irrational. We've discovered the cause, but we've also discovered in the cause that they have no reason for the belief that they hold. In a recent debate between Rowan Williams and Richard Dawkins, they were talking about consciousness at Oxford, and Dawkins says in that, he says, well, there was some problem that Rowan Williams raised, and Dawkins says, well, I guess as a materialist, I would have to say that the mind is just the brain. And the agnostic adjudicator, Professor Anthony Kenny, said, I think that's sad. And Richard Dawkins said, what's sad? He said, I think it's sad that you're committed to that view, that you have an a priori assumption that that's all the mind can be. And I should say, I share that. I find the argument of philosophical materialism unpersuasive, and therefore I remain open to a reality beyond the material world. Secondly, I find the Christian narrative, the Christian worldview, both livable and lovable, one that brings more light than darkness. C.S. Lewis said that he believed in the sun, not so much because he looked at the sun, but because by the sun he could see everything else. And the Christian worldview, from the doctrine of creation, which invites me to worship and wonder, to the doctrine of the fall, which invites me to perceive evil and unjust reality in the world, these are things to which my experience of life says yes, they resonate with the world that I see. Thirdly, and perhaps surprisingly, I find the moral example of people of faith and Christian people compelling. Now, that may sound like a disastrous argument, because any of us could recite any number of terrible things that Christian people have done. But the argument that religion poisons everything, Hitch's favourite argument, is an argument that I've found myself unable to come with, because Christopher Hitchens' definition of religion includes Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin he declares to be religious, and it excludes Martin Luther King, who he declares to be entirely secular in his commitments. And I think to myself, well, if you can define religion as something that includes Stalin and excludes Martin Luther King, then I'm against whatever that thing is. I just don't know why you would call it religion. Christian history, for all its many and great faults, has been very impressive. The rise of hospitals and trade unions and charity, the idea of universal human rights, the abolition of the slave trade, the aesthetics of the Christian music of Bach, the Gothic cathedrals and the fertile ground for the rise of science are for me impressive ways of being in the world. And other people see this who are not themselves Christians. So Neil Ferguson, the eminent Scottish historian, who longs for the re-Christianisation of Europe, although he himself cannot believe. Or Matthew Paris, in a now famous article, an atheist, says this: "Now a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. Sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. Education and training will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings about a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real and the change is good." I'm going to skip 2 points to get to the end, so we've got some time for questions. I want to suggest as we finish a way forward, and I want to do it by telling you the story of Michael Polanyi. Polanyi was a Hungarian scientist with a distinguished career in chemistry, who later in life turned from science to philosophy. And one of the reasons he turned from science to philosophy later in life is that he was troubled by the claims being made by philosophers about science who themselves had not practiced science. The logical positivists were claiming science as the only legitimate path to knowledge. And Polanyi's trouble with that was twofold. Firstly, he said on philosophical grounds he thought that was an untenable account for knowledge. But secondly, as a practicing scientist, he thought it was an untenable account even of scientific knowledge. With regard to the first, Polanyi's understanding of a proper epistemology was based on the idea of tacit knowledge. Polanyi said that as well as the focus of our knowledge, we all inhabit a tacit knowledge that rests on intuition and authority and tradition, creativity and imagination. And as we do our work of investigation, our pursuit of knowledge is always personal. Polanyi said that far from being objective, true knowledge requires commitment and imagination and faith. It requires skin in the game. Knowledge is acquired by doubt. Of course that's true. I think that's undoubtedly true, if that's not a contradictory way of saying it. Knowledge is of course acquired by doubt, but Polanyi's point is that the focal point of doubt, the focal point as you're wondering whether Shakespeare's Hamlet is too good for this world, or is culpably indecisive, whether you're wondering whether light is a wave or a particle, whether you're wondering whether God is real or not, at that point of doubt, which is so crucial, we all exist in a tacit dimension of knowledge that involves commitment and faith and imagination. We don't just work as objective observers of the universe, but we are in it. It's a process that he called, which he got from Christian theology, faith-seeking understanding. That's how he understood knowledge and epistemology, but he saw science as working like that as well, because as the scientist goes into her lab, Polanyi says she is not full of just impartial objectivity. She's being creative and intuitive, testing hypothesis using her imagination. Polanyi's point is that there is no one-size-fits-all epistemology. Rather, warranted knowledge is subjective. It involves a subject being fully present and committed and curious and full of faith. And as they go to their object of inquiry, there's no one-size-fits-all process except for humility before the object of your inquiry. The process of acquiring knowledge requires us to be humble and to ask the subject of inquiry what epistemology it requires, what method it requires to be known. And if God is true, if the God I'm talking about is true, what would that look like for you to pursue him? And I want to say it would not be unscientific if it looked a bit like prayer. If it looked a bit like pursuing the knowledge of God in the case of a Christian community, if it involved faith and intuition. It could happen through a work of art or a piece of music. It's not to say that Christian faith or any faith is unaware of the evidence or irrational, but it will be personal. And it won't be less than rational, and Christianity doesn't invite you to believe things that can't possibly be true, but it will be more than rational. And so to pursue this object of inquiry is to pursue not just an object, but a subject. And I guess I want to say that I think pursuing that subject is worth your time and attention. Well, that's all I wanted to say. I think we have got 5 minutes left for questions and comments. So thank you very much for your attention and patience. And perhaps you'd like to open up for your comments. Thanks.
I just had a comment and another question in regards to your response to atheism. So the comment is when you were discussing materialism and its belief within the sort of scientific realm. You said that most physicists don't believe in materialism because they think there's more than just the three dimensions of space and time. When, in general, when people talk about materialism, they're talking more about the natural world versus the supernatural world. So I don't think there's many high-level physicists who would say, I believe there's a supernatural world. Just because it's different than saying, I believe there's more than three dimensions of space.
Thanks, that's helpful.
And so my question was, you said that you believe in God because you have been persuaded to move on that. And you also said that you were unpersuaded to move away, to move towards materialism and away from a belief in the supernatural.
Yeah.
But burden of proof is on you to show that God exists or that a supernatural realm exists rather than us on if we don't hold that belief to show that it's not the case.
Sure, thanks. I'll try and respond to both of those. That's great. So on the first one, I don't mean to give the impression and just a value of it if I have that, all those physicists are cruising around going to churches and praying to God and all the rest of it. Not at all. And in fact, one of the powerful evidences of the new atheism is the comparative lack of faith in a lot of scientists, as not. You know what I mean? My only point there is that I think that kind of that raw philosophical materialism seems to me Dawkins speaking more as a biologist and than as a physicist or a philosopher, and I think that he lands a lot of his argument on the belief that there's only philosophical materialism. And I'm not saying that people who aren't philosophical materialists are therefore believers in God, not at all. I'm just saying that I think that is a shaky foundation for someone like him to stand on. So I wouldn't think that at all compelled you to believe in God, but it does open the possibility of a non-purely materialistic thing. The second one, I think I differ on that, as in I think that the hypothesis that there is one God who created everything is sufficiently elegant and simple that I don't think the burden of proof easily moves between the two parties. Yeah. So I think obviously belief in the flying spaghetti monster or something would require some believing, and I do think that belief in God, as I'm talking about him, is of a different category to belief in the flying spaghetti monster. And so I don't know where I put the burden of proof. If it's not totally philosophically naive, I'd like to just leave it in the middle rather than put it on either one of us. Okay, I think I've said the wrong thing because a whole lot of hands just went up. Who wants to correct me first? We'll just go first in. Did we? Okay. We spoke first.
I wasn't necessarily just a straight correct. I put up my hands because you didn't see me finish. But this addresses that. First of all, the compliment. That was very well done. You changed it slightly from the previous talk to which I appreciated 2 points, which you did. Especially the Sam Harris one. That was one. Anyway, so you seem to come to this at a very presuppositionalist apologetics thing, which means you assume that Christianity is true while presenting it to us, as opposed to taking a neutral perspective. So I was wondering, have you, in your position on this, now of course, many scientists don't assume that philosophical naturalism is absolutely true. They adopt it as a methodology. It's merely a process by which work is. So you only, of course, if you're Christian scientists and not, that's still accept naturally. But my question is, have you approached Christianity or looked at it from the neutral position, the null hypothesis, the utility is proven to be absolute true, the testable parts, I'll accept it. And the non-testable parts, I can't necessarily accept them because there's no positive evidence for them. So my question is, have you looked at it from a neutral perspective, which assumes nothing about this?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think I haven't, because I wouldn't know where to go to do that. Like, as in, to the best of my ability, I've tried to think, what are the best arguments against this faith that I hold, and what would it look like for me to abandon this faith, and how much would have to come into to bear on that. And I've done that to the best of my ability, but I think I want to say that I also think most of us, if not all of us, I just wonder where that place is by which you could stand, and step outside. You know, as Heidegger says, we're thrown into the world, and I think my little Polanyi offshoot is to say that I think that most of it's more honest and a better account to say that we all are invested in the things that we believe in, and that the idea that the conversation is happening in this neutral kind of secular space, I think, doesn't actually do justice to either side, or actually account for the acquisition of knowledge on either side. So I think the best I can do is to be public, but not objective. So I've tried to give reasons that are publicly comprehensible, but I don't pretend that they're objective. I think my understanding of epistemology, as you can guess, is not foundationalist, but coherentist. So I think, the foundationalist picture is like, foundations building up. I think my understanding is more like a spider's web, where a whole lot of things. And I can imagine there's certain things that are holding onto the tree, and if they moved, I would have to move out of the Christian faith. But lots of it's mutually supportive. So I could imagine a falsification thing, but it would take a bit, as I think it would for all of us. I think I'm getting kicked off. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, thanks, Rory. Thanks, Rory. I hope you found this talk interesting and engaging. Maybe you've been challenged by some of the points he's raised. Don't forget that. So if you've got any more questions, don't forget Rory will be hanging around our stall for a couple of minutes, 5 or 10 minutes or so. And then, whoever's there, we might go somewhere and continue talking and discussing the topic. Also, remember, we've got some resources on the back of the handout. We've got a lot of those books at the stall. So, feel free to drop by. And thanks for coming.